Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 11 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I really loved talking with Lane Pease for this episode. Lane is the program director of Kate's Club in Atlanta and is herself a widowed parent. We discussed so many topics that I found fascinating, and I hope you will too. Topics we discussed include building resiliency in kids after loss, the balance between maintaining structure and routine and giving your family a break when needed, when to choose one-on-one therapy versus a peer grief group for your child, traumatic grief, what it is and how does it differ from adaptive grief, and signs your child might be experiencing this, warden's tasks of mourning, how the surviving parent's ability to cope affects the child's ability to cope, the importance of open and honest communication with your child regarding cause of death, especially in difficult situations, and finally Kate's Club's programs, which are a fantastic resource if you live in Atlanta. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Lane Pease. My guest today is Lane Pease, who's the program director at Kate's Club and is also a widowed parent herself. She's joining us from her office in Atlanta, Georgia. Lane, welcome.
Thank you.
So I was reading some of your blog posts, and in one of them you had a quote from Fred Rogers, also known, of course, as Mr. Rogers, and it really jumped out at me, and I was wondering if you could just start off by reading that quote for us, please.
Sure. Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be manageable. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone.
I love that.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and I'm thinking maybe that really speaks to the essence of what organizations like yours are doing in the kind of environment you're constructing for your kids and families in your programs.
I think so. It's really our kind of, like you said, a foundation of our program that we can talk about anything, and we have supportive people in our life to share those things with. And we help families. You know, a lot of what we do, too, is help families talk about those things within their family.
Right. Yeah. So before we talk a little bit more about Kate's Club and the programs you guys offer, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your personal experience as a widowed parent. Maybe starting out with just, a little bit about your life before your husband died. What was your life like before everything changed?
Yeah, so we were kind of living the American dream. We had our house. We had a 3-year-old at the time. We had dated 3.5 years before being married, and I guess we were married at the time about 5 years. I was expecting our second child, and that had been trying a while, so that was a really happy event that I was about 3 months pregnant. And I told him one day, I said, you really need to see about that cough. And so we thought he'd had the flu, and it just wasn't getting better. So that was kind of the turning point with that word, you need to see somebody about that cough. That kind of everything changed.
And a cough, doesn't, I guess necessarily, a lot of things could cause a cough. But so then what happened next?
Right. So he went to the doctor. They said, let's just do a chest x-ray to be sure. And they found tumors in his lungs.
Oh, wow.
He was not a smoker. It wasn't lung cancer. It was a very rare kind of cancer called extragonadal germ cell cancer. So it's actually a form of testicular cancer that happens in our leftover germ cells that we have throughout the body. So, not as curable, unfortunately, as testicular cancer. So.
Wow. Okay. I haven't heard of that. So thank you for.
Yeah.
And then when he died, how old were your kids? Or was your second one born yet?
Right. She was born. She was 9 months old. So he did get to see her. He lived about 16 months after diagnosis with as a lot of people on the cancer journey understand, a lot of back and forth and, he's getting better. Oh, no, now it's not working kind of experience. So my daughter Lucy was 9 months old. My daughter Zelda was 4 at the time he died. And he was 37, and I was 30, just turned 33.
Okay. And so, and how old are your kids now?
Oh, they are 19 and almost 23.
Okay. All right. So you have a lot of experience to share with us then.
Yeah, it's a long road.
Yeah. So what were those early months like then? You had a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old, and you were a brand new widowed parent. What was it like at first?
It was incredibly difficult. And when I work with families now, I try to be real about that this is incredibly difficult. I had gone from, in a few months we had one child and two parents to two children and one parent. And it was overwhelming. I had a lot of family support. My parents were very supportive at the time. They were still in good enough health to help me. My sister lived in town, and I had friends. So, I had a lot of help, but that still didn't, still sometimes you have to be on your own a lot of the time. And it was hard. It was lonely. And every day, I think at the end of the day, I was like, we made it through, and everybody's in bed, and let me have a few minutes of just taking a sigh of relief.
Yeah. I wonder if, I've heard and read about how kids have to re-grieve as they go through different developmental milestones. So since your kids were so young, I guess they've had lots and lots of developmental milestones since then. What's been your experience around that?
I think I tell people that all the time. That's so true, Jenny. I saw my oldest daughter who had had memories of her dad, and she was definitely the one impacted in a more, way that we can see, or her behaviors. And really, it was, she would say she's okay, she's fine. When she hit about 12 and the adolescent, the hormones started kicking in, and this whole where they're just at a brand new developmental stage. They've never, have no inkling that's going to hit them that way. It was very challenging for several years in her teenage years. And of course, this has happened when she was 4, but she was, and I got her support right away. She did a camp from the local hospice. She went to a little support group for a while. And then we kind of put it away. We still talked about dad, and we were very open, but her feelings, she's just a more reserved person. So adolescence really hurt her, brought it back up for her. I think with my younger daughter, who was just a baby, at every stage, it was hard when she would see her uncle, who she was very close to, with his daughter, her cousin, who she was very close to too, but knowing she didn't have that. So as she got older and kind of realized that missing piece, so they just handled it differently, but definitely, I see it all the time with the children I work with as well, that they're doing fine, you're cruising for a while, and you think, oh, I got this. And then, if you think about it, they're almost a new person are coming into at each age.
Right.
So that's very challenging.
And along those lines of cruising along and thinking you got this, I'm wondering what kind of surprise gotchas, I think everybody expects that a wedding or a graduation or something will be difficult with that missing parent, but what kinds of other surprise things kind of hit you out of left field, or things that you've, whether yourself or that you've seen in your work, that people maybe didn't know to expect?
I think when my kids were younger, one of the things that got me, and it was kind of a weekly basis, is just going somewhere on a Sunday. Where I lived, a lot of the dads traveled, so it wasn't unusual through the week to see a lot of moms, young moms. I was, had young children, so out with their kids with dinner or at soccer practice or wherever. But on Sundays, all the dads were home. If you went out to dinner or lunch, rather, or if you tried to go to the YMCA swimming, I just finally just put that out of our schedules on a Sunday, at least. It was family day. And those were very difficult for me. some other, I think, those things that you don't expect is really just those little things, those kind of the mundane of being able to look at somebody and say, have they lost their mind when you're talking about your children and there's nobody there to look at? So you start thinking, maybe I've lost my mind because you don't have that partnership any longer to say, hey, who is crazy here? Is it me or is it her?
One of the things that I read recently that really surprised me, somebody gave an example that when their kid turned 15, 16, they're learning to drive. That was hard. And
that was a hard one too.
Well, I expected them to say because they had always assumed their dad would teach them or other people's dads were teaching them. But in this case, they said the girl was terrified to learn to drive and potentially screw up, cause an accident, and have some other family become, lose a parent. Mm-hmm. And I that was so interesting to me. And so now I put that on my radar screen as something to keep in mind. I would never have thought of that in a million years. Did your family do anything to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and things like that through the years?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of fallen off through the years. Again, we still talk about their dad. They ask questions about him, but in the beginning, on his birthdays, we did the balloon release. We would maybe light a candle at the holidays. Always mention him. We did the note writing at first. I'm trying to think, it's been a long time, and not that those things aren't, those days don't come to you anymore, but after so many years, we stopped kind of marking them, but to say, hey, they would have been your dad's birthday and he would be this old. And so it becomes matter of fact. I tell families though I work with is really getting everybody's opinion to see, what's helpful for them and what's not. For some children, that they may not want certain things going to the cemetery, may be very triggering for them. It may not be a thing that they find helpful. So kind of working together is what we all agree on. Do we want to have his favorite meal or her favorite meal, or do we want to go and do an act of service in their honor? And so just trying to work as a team, really, to see what's helpful.
So how about, though, when you've got multiple kids and you've got diametrically opposing opinions on what, one wants to go to the cemetery, absolutely, and the other absolutely does not, or, any of those things?
I think really kind of not nudging, but not forcing kids for things like that. Saying, this is why I want to do it, this is why I think it'd be helpful. But if they're very opposed to that, asking them what would be helpful. So you go to the kid with one kid to the cemetery and the other kid maybe does something else.
Okay. So it's okay to not do everything together as a family unit then, to mark the occasion all together in the same way.
Right, I think so. I think everybody's at a different place. Everybody had their individual relationship with the person who died, and everybody is going to still have that individual relationship with the person who died. Death doesn't end a relationship, but it changes it dramatically. So how they're able to navigate that ongoing relationship is really important, but it's going to be different for everyone.
My next question, and I think this will kind of segue us into the topics around Kate's Club and your work there. Sometimes I hear the conventional wisdom, kids are resilient. And, and it's kind of said with, what, love them, they'll be fine. And I'm wondering what your reaction or thoughts about that are.
It's funny that you said that, because that's probably one of my least favorite phrases in the human language. The English language, I would like to, sometimes I want to shake people when they say that, because I think they have, I've said in a training, I actually spoke on resiliency at a training a couple of years ago, and I said, I think we want kids to be like little bouncy balls that you get out of the gumball machine where they bounce back from everything automatically. And they're not. Now, they're not the medicine ball you use in gym class that you can't pick up.
You can't bounce back at all, right?
A basketball, where you need help to bounce it. And that was my analogy I came up with. I was very proud of that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because we know children can be resilient, but we know there's factors that have to do with building resiliency in them. They are not automatically any more resilient than we are, or that anybody, just because they're young does not mean. If anything, they're very vulnerable to a lot of things. Losing a parent in childhood is one of the most adverse events that can occur in a child's life. So to just say they're resilient, they'll be fine, is not enough. Things that build resiliency in children are having at least one trusted adult in their life. It's having adequate support, so that they're not, if you're worried about other things like where you're going to sleep, what you're going to eat, those things, it's very difficult. We know that giving them a voice and giving them choices with clear boundaries, those are all things that build resilience, but they're not resilient just because they're young.
Well, and I often read the advice to maintain structure and routine, and I struggle to understand, and maybe it depends on the age of the kids. Maybe there's, right? But, if structure and routine might involve doing certain activities that, they're just not feeling up to. Like, you often read the advice for adults, right? If you're grieving, it's okay to stay in your pajamas all day. Or if you're not up to going to this holiday party, it's fine. But does that apply to kids, or how does that apply?
Yeah.
Similarly or differently?
It's interesting because I think this is what I tell the parents I work with. Structure and routine is really important. You also need to give yourself a break, and you need to give your kid a break. So if you have a day that we just can't do, we want to watch videos and stay in our pajamas because it's all too much. I think that's fine. I see another thing I think that sometimes isn't helpful is going into so many activities. So the family's so super busy. And I hear parents say that a lot. I'm just keeping my kids busy. We're just staying busy. So that they're so afraid to focus, let those emotions happen, let those feelings happen. So we all can, it's everything in life is a balance. And I think even with, yes, maintain structure and routine, because children, especially young children, really do feel safe with that. But there may be things that are just too painful for them. If they were playing baseball, and their dad always coached in baseball, and they say, no, I don't want to do it. So why don't we take a season off? And then maybe revisit that later, and then maybe push them and nudge them a little to say, you really loved baseball. Will you give it a try? Will you go back this season and see how you feel? I mean, the thing
is,
say
no, then that's okay. Or how hard do you push?
I think there's something I like to say is mellow manipulation. Bribery, not bribery. And that's maybe, let's give it a try. If you give it a try this many times, if you go to this many practices or you go to this game and you still don't want to do it, we'll take another break and you can let me know what you want to do. Maybe there's a different sport a child wants to try if they've always loved sports. I think there is a danger of them isolating and not wanting to do anything. And so that's why pushing them to find an outlet is really important. But again, giving them some say and some voice in what they do.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So talking a little bit about Kate's Club then, I guess first, what is your role there and how long have you been involved there?
I'm the program director here, and so I really oversee all our programming and make sure what we're doing is best practice in child bereavement. So I oversee all our therapeutic nature of our program. I've been here over 6 years now. I went back to school several years ago and got a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling.
Ah,
So,
okay. And was this a big change from whatever you were doing before?
Yeah, I was teaching English as a second language to adults before. So I went into school knowing I either wanted to work with immigrants and refugees, or I was very comfortable working with grief.
Mm.
Just so happened my internship ended up working out at a hospice because I was really comfortable with that. And from that internship, I learned about the position here.
Ah, oh, that's cool. Okay. So I think you guys have a number of different programs. Can you tell us a little bit about the types, if a family lived in Atlanta, what kinds of things do you offer?
Right. So we're a little different. We really have a social, recreational, and therapeutic model. We do no one-on-one counseling. It's all groups. We have year-round services. So we have monthly, we call them clubhouse days, where the kids come in and they stay all day. They stay 6 hours. If you've ever been around the traffic in Atlanta, you would know why we actually structured it that way on the weekend. And
okay.
They do some activities led with their buddy volunteers. And they do some activities led by professional therapists and other people. Like we might have improv, or we might have circus arts, yoga, a visit from the pet therapy dog. So there's all kinds of things going on those days. We also have outings 3 times a year. We have programs once monthly for the whole family called Family Nights. Also do programs at holidays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, and Siblings Day, and the winter holidays for the whole family. We also have a traumatic loss group that meets for 4 weeks for suicide, homicide, and drug overdose deaths.
Okay. Well, let's start with the, what did you call them? The program days. So, well, first of all, what age group of kids, and do you break them out by age group, or is it mixed?
Yeah. So we serve children 5 to 18, and we do break them up by age group.
Okay.
But they all come on the same day, and then we break them into their age groups.
Gotcha. Okay. And so how many kids would be in one group, approximately?
I like to keep it no more than 8. Sometimes when our kids get a little older, it might be 10 in each group, or 11, but 8 is a really good size group. With the little ones, maybe 6.
And do the kids start to form relationships, like a new peer group of?
Oh, yes. I think that's one of the most important things we do, is to connect kids with other kids who just get it, as they say. My friends are nice, they'll say, or my friends just don't understand me, but people at Kate's Club really understand. So we do have families and kids just really form relationships outside of Kate's Club and inside Kate's Club.
It sounds like it could reduce some of the isolation
yes,
a little bit,
definitely,
for those families. So, and then these outings you mentioned, how does that come into play with? Well, and I read in your model that you guys feel that recreation is very important and fun and essential to the grieving process. Can you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Well, children's language is play, really. I mean, when they play, that's that's why people do play therapy, is because that's really how they express themselves. So recreation, we think, is really important. We also think that sometimes when you're grieving, especially in a family, you feel guilty about having fun again. Maybe you think that that's not okay, but or maybe you've taken over so much responsibility at home that you don't feel as much like a child anymore, even though you're just 12 or 13. So recreation is a really huge part of, you can play, you can have fun, and that's when you build friendships too. One of the programs I forgot to mention, because it is just for our members, but we go to camp for the a long weekend. And so during that camp time, most of it's focused on camp activities and recreation, but you learn how to support one another. You try things that maybe you think you could not do, like rock climbing or paddle boarding or the high ropes course if you're a teenager. And so, really emphasizing that component.
I want to take us off on a tangent here for a second, because something you mentioned about, maybe there's a 12 or 13-year-old or teenager at home taking on a lot of responsibility. And I've been thinking a lot about that, and I wonder is there a fine line between, you want kids to grow up and to be family members who contribute and who learn useful skills. Is there a fine line between that and I don't know, maybe some of them erroneously feeling like they have to, take the place of that parent that died, or, sometimes you even hear, to a teenage boy, well, you need to become the man of the house.
Oh, yes. You do hear that.
Is that something that you think do you hear that? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a real concern. But I also think as parents, we know our children pretty well. And I think when it becomes something of a burden to a child, when they're thinking about adult things that they should not be thinking about. So let's say for a 12-year-old to help with dinner, or to a 13-year-old to even cook dinner for the family once a week and help with their siblings. There's, of course, that's a normal part of functioning in a family. And yes, now maybe that one parent's gone, you have to do a little more. Mm-hmm. If they're worried about, if they're very parentified, and if they're starting to tell their siblings what to do all the time, or they're worried about whether the bills are going to get paid, or if they're just taking on more that you see that is stressing them out, or seeing things that, no, that's an adult concern. And I tell parents, especially moms, it seems to be, is that they need to reassure the child that they're still going to take care of them, that they're the adult, they're the ones in charge. Sometimes that happens if mom has never worked outside the home, or at least from what the child can remember. So they really get this very worried feeling of, I don't know if she knows how to do this. The other side is, does dad know how to is he going to manage the house? And kind of stereotypical, but that's more of what you see, is that, okay, everything's going to fall apart at home now. And I have to. So maybe the older kids kind of take over for things that mom would do. I think more of a team approach is like everybody has a role. You might have to do a little more now, but I'm still the parent. And that's a really important message to send very clearly. just explicitly to tell them that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's really helpful. So thank you for taking that tangent. Tangent with me. So back to Kate's Club. And we talked about camp and some of the programs. What would be the differences, or how should someone think about, should their kid go to a therapist? Should their kid go to a group program like you offer? Should they do both? When do you think one or the other might be more appropriate?
Well, again, I think parents know their children pretty well. I find a lot of kids are oppositional to one-on-one therapy, where some are really welcoming it. I think if you see, just kind of like with us, the adults, if our grief's making us maybe not function, so if the child is continually months down the road wanting to stay out of school, if their anxiety is super high about anything happening to you, the surviving parent, that's a thing you see a lot. If their anxiety is high, if they're not sleeping well at all, they're not eating, or they're eating too much, kind of those signals. And I think it's important to definitely see a therapist who is well-versed, and you should interview them, that has worked with children that are grieving. We don't, what you see a lot of children getting diagnosed with this and that, when it's really just not just grief, but it's grief, and they need to work through their grief. I think a group is helpful for anybody, whether they're having any issues or not. A lot of our kids see a therapist and come to us. Some of them just come to us. Now, where you would not want to push a child into a group setting is if they're having extreme, maybe more trauma reactions from the death, and then you would probably want to do therapy first.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. I think the concept is called traumatic grief.
Yes.
So at first, I guess, can you define that, or help us understand what is traumatic grief, and how does that differ maybe from, I don't know, what it would be called, regular grief, or?
Right. Adaptive grief, I think, is what I would say.
Adaptive grief.
Traumatic grief is really where trauma symptoms such as anxiety, things we know about PTSD, heart palpitations, those flashbacks about the death, things that interfere with their normal grief, kind of adaptive grief process. So they can't look at pictures of the deceased because it makes them so triggered. They isolate, they withdraw from everything. They have panic attacks. In school, maybe they hear sirens and they're having panic attacks because they remember the sirens from when their parent died. Maybe, they can't be separated at all from their caregiver now because their anxiety is so high. So you just look for those. So traumatic grief is really when the kind of the symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, interfering with kind of the normative or adaptive grief process. And at what,
are you talking in the first few weeks, in the first few months? Like, I know there's not an exact measurement, but, at what point?
It could be years later. Something can re-trigger it. We know children, even very young children, can have subconscious memories. So you may think everything's going fine and a child hears something, such as, and they start to have those symptoms. So it really can happen at any point in the process. More often it happens in the first months and you'll see it. Mm-hmm. But it can happen later on if something triggers kind of that flashback from perhaps when the death happened.
And what, I suppose that something like witnessing a murder of your parent might trigger a traumatic grief, but are there other ways that it can be triggered or things that might be less obvious?
Sure. Interestingly enough, we do know that homicide and suicide are the two most causes of death that cause the most traumatic grief in children and adults. But after that, we kind of have a separation between what the children experience and what adults experience. A long illness of a parent can actually show more PTSD symptoms in children than it does in adults. Adults seem to have, if a car accident, a sudden heart attack, adults might have more PTSD than children actually witnessing a long illness.
Interesting. Okay, wait, let me see if I got what you just said. That in adults, that something like a sudden heart attack or a sudden accident is more likely to trigger traumatic response than a lengthy illness. But in children, it's the exact opposite?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Because I think some people maybe who, sometimes I hear, if there's a long illness, maybe people have time to kind of get used to it or something before it happens. And thinking that somehow might lessen the trauma of it.
Right.
It's so interesting.
Well, I have a couple of theories, and I think they're looking more closely at why this is. Because they see children that, I remember my parents sobbing in the room when they found out that the treatment wasn't working. So they go back to that reminder. But also, many times when there's a long illness, there's been a lot of upheaval in the family. So there's been a lot of other people caring for them. Maybe their parents both going away for the other parent's treatment, or the sibling. We deal with siblings too. That can really be huge. So also, I'm not sure that children have the capacity to do that anticipatory grief. You may say, well, daddy's going, this is what's happening. Many times too, let me kind of backpedal that families just assume the children know they have cancer. They're going into hospice care. This means the person's going to die. Some of our children have experienced the illness of their parent most of their life. We have had children here that are 6 or 7 that their parent had cancer since they were 1 or 2. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the normal. So the death was still very shocking to them because nobody really said what this means. it was normal to them.
Okay.
Also looking in the case of cancer, ALS, these long illnesses where your body changes so dramatically, and maybe there's a lot of hospital admissions, and there's a lot of things that people sometimes lose the ability to speak to maybe they have with they just change completely, and so a child watching that, it can be very traumatic as well.
That's so interesting. And anticipatory grief, you're right, that's the word I was looking for before, which I had never heard of that word until I started down this journey too. Okay, that is really interesting. So is there a way, like what should parents be thinking about, or who do they access, or how do they begin to figure out, like, I don't know, does my child have traumatic grief, or don't they? Is there how would you approach that, I guess, as a parent?
I think, again, parents pretty much know their children well. If your child is not sleeping, if they're frightened easily, if they're really having trouble being separated from you, if they can't talk about the loved one because they say it makes them too upset, I think you get in, again, with a trained therapist in grief, a therapist who knows grief very well. What we're doing here at Kate's Club, we're just implementing is called the GIFT tool. It's a tool to screen for traumatic grief and PTSD in children, so that we can let parents know and guardians know as the child comes in if they can go on into our programs, or if they need to seek therapy first to deal with the trauma component of the grief. But I think, again, you watch your child and reach out to, kind of the experts in the field. I take a lot of calls sometimes from all over the country that are, maybe they're looking for a place in their community, but I can certainly try to help, or to talk to them about kind of what is normal response. And a lot of times it is a normal grief response. But, the normal grief response, it is going to lessen as time goes on.
And so what is the implication then, I guess, of not addressing the traumatic grief? They really won't be able to move through their grief process, because the trauma part is too triggering for them to work then on those grief things we work on, like remembering the person. What are we going to do to remember them? How do you incorporate them in your life? How do you see your life going forward? All those things that we work on here at Kate's Club, for instance, that kids with that trauma piece may not be able to do. I see. Oh, that's so interesting. So the grief, I was just reading, is it called Warden's 4 tasks or something?
Warden's task of mourning.
Is that what you're referring to as like the normal grief tasks?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about those a lot. So those are really to accept the reality of the loss, to process the pain, to adapt to a world without the deceased. And I think that's the hardest one. And then to relocate that person in your emotional life and move forward. And when I came on to Kate's Club, I told them about those tasks. And I said, I think these are really important to incorporate in our programs to make sure what we're doing is really working with those.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Okay, and so the traumatic grief then interferes with those 4 tasks. That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that you guys are starting to do a screening. Do you happen to know if there's any, I don't know, like self-screening resources available for parents to kind of educate themselves on it and think about it, if they maybe don't have access to your screening, for example?
Right. I think a great website and kind of with a lot of information, and I think probably you can look at a lot things on there, is the Child Traumatic Stress Network.
Okay.
And I'll make sure you get that information, but that's a great one because it'll have kind of tips to deal with it, but it'll also, before the tips, it'll show you any symptoms that may be happening.
Okay. All right, good. We'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes, so listeners can go to the page for this episode and get right to that. Good. Okay, good. Very good. So let's see. What about Kate's Club haven't we talked about yet? Well, here's a question, maybe back to the more kind of pragmatic. I mean, when do you usually see families? Are they usually recently lost, long time lost? What do you think any is more effective than the other, or?
I think we see them all over the spectrum. I do have people call me just a couple of weeks afterwards sometimes because, again, as parents, we want to be doing the right thing right away, right? So I usually try to gently put them off a little while because it can be very emotional to come in very quickly. And if it's just too soon, they may just, have the experience that they don't want to return. So we see everybody from a couple of months to 5-6 years down the line if they've never gotten help. So it's really a wide range. I'd say a lot of people, it's about 6 months to a year, it seems.
And how long do kids usually stay in your program?
Kids usually come regularly for about a year or two. And then they can taper off, but that's the great thing about our programs is then they can still come to camp every year. And they can still go to outings and they do the more recreational things. What I have happen sometimes is a child just says, I don't want to come right now. I'd rather do this. I'd rather play sports or I'm too busy or I'm feeling pretty good. And then either they get to a new developmental stage and revisit their grief. And maybe another loss, a grandparent or someone else in their life dies and they feel like they need the help again. So that's why we remain open-ended too, is so they can, they can always revisit us if they need to.
Okay, that makes sense. And in terms of those families that you mentioned, it might be just too soon, it might be too overwhelming for the kid to participate. What, I guess, if the parent feels like, okay, I can see it might be too overwhelming, but they need something. I guess what at that point would be more productive for them to be pursuing?
I think in those first weeks, it's really just the parent or the caregiver being there, maybe reading, but just being together as a family. They did studies about kind of what's most helpful they did it with mothers and children in this study about what helped the children through their grief of the other parent most. And it really wasn't what the mother said. It was just how she responded to the child. So it really had everything to do with maternal warmth. So I know a lot of moms out there, because I was one going, I'm not doing the right thing, continually beating yourself up. I'm not doing the right thing. I had a freezer full of frozen chicken breasts because I had this best intention of cooking every night. And then I would put them in the freezer and would go out to eat for the first, who knows how long. And so we're really hard on ourselves, but we know, again, maternal warmth and how they connected, not exactly what they said with the child, but how they connected with the child was actually the huge indicator of how well a child would do. So just know that in those first months, a lot of times a child just needs you. But I mean, I say weeks, months, they can, please, reach out to an organization or Kate's Club and we'll get you on the process. I just, want to make sure people are finding us when they're ready.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I just want to dig a little deeper on, maternal warmth and how the mother or the parent responds. I guess, what does that look like? Are there a few things that are helpful or maybe a few things you shouldn't do or say? Like, what does that really mean to be warm as a parent? That's a really basic question, but I think some examples of, or maybe things that people, maybe somebody, oh, it's okay, don't cry, that seems right. Like maybe.
I think it's really connecting with children on their level, looking in the eye, being with them, as far as warmth goes. I think, people it can be a spectrum of how a parent reacts. So we know how the surviving parent copes after the death of one parent is the number one indicator of how a child will cope with their grief, how the outcomes. And of all the research, and there's not much in child bereavement, of all that research, that's the one thing we know. So if a mom, for instance, or dad is so overcome with grief that they're not functioning, they're not getting out of bed, they're not able to do those daily tasks that children, feel secure with, if they're not able to parent, period. Yes, a child's going to become very anxious and worried, and you're not going to see good stuff happen necessarily. On the other hand, on the other side of the continuum, if a parent says, we're fine, and smiles all the time and says, everything's going to be great, everything's fine, I'm fine, and then she doesn't cry or he doesn't cry or show any emotion, the child's going to get the message, well, I should be fine too. Why am I sad? I shouldn't be sad. Mom or dad's not sad. They're doing fine. We're all going fine, but I feel so sad inside, but I can't talk about it. So again, you see outcomes that aren't maybe as healthy. So it's kind of their moderate way of, you're functioning, maybe just barely sometimes, but you're saying, I'm sad today, or I'm sad at this moment, but we're going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. So you're really modeling good grief for the child, because in a way, that's how grief is. You're sad, you're overcome at moments, and then you're okay. You do what you need to do, and then you're sad again, and then you're okay. You can talk about those good memories. I think sometimes that takes a little time, that maybe right at first, that may not be as, right off the bat. Children may not want to talk about that, but as you go, you talk about all the good things that you had with that person. Sometimes you may have some very complicated feelings about that person too, so keep that in mind. Not everybody had a wonderful relationship with the parent who died. So really having that open communication and being able to share those things is really important. One thing I'd warn against, though, is to do the kind of using the parent as the guilty to reprimand. Now, your mom wouldn't be happy. Would your mom like it if you did that? Your dad, how would your dad feel if he saw you behaving that way? And kids have reported that really makes them feel bad. That is really not a helpful thing to say.
Okay. So it's almost like the surviving parent is kind of using that as a guilt trip mechanism.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay. And what are you're talking about various conversations with kids. What do you think about conversations around the cause of death, when the cause of death may be difficult or something that's hard to talk about?
Yeah. Well, it's like that quote I read at the beginning, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable can be manageable. But if we don't mention it, then children can't manage it. So a lot of people, their first response in the case of a suicide death or drug overdoses is the most one, sometimes homicide, they want to shield children. But really, even very young children can be told in age-appropriate ways the truth. I believe in telling the truth, and most experts do for a variety of reasons. Just a very clear reason is children usually find out. If they find out later, they can have, they can feel a real betrayal of trust in the people or the person that kept it from them. If you lied to me about this, what else are you lying to me about? Usually they know that a secret's being kept from them. I read something that said secrets in families are like black holes. So they know. A lot of times they have a lot of questions, and they're sometimes they guess. Older children may even guess and know what happened, but know they are not supposed to talk about it. As children Google, and I've seen this case of in domestic homicide and domestic homicide suicide, things like that, or publicized deaths, that they will Google the parent's name. Usually those ways, they're not good outcomes because, again, they had this sense of betrayal. Everybody else knew and I didn't. Mm-hmm. But going back to how we can tell little children, the truth, because there's a way to explain suicide in terms of mental illness and having a sickness in your brain, maybe the brain wasn't working right. We can talk about anything. You need to do it in age-appropriate ways, but, there's a lot of good resources out there to help you do that. But I definitely, my motto is to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking here about, if it's a really, really awful, terrible situation. Let's say you mentioned a domestic violence homicide or something. You probably can't make it any worse. You can't make it, what am I trying to say? You can make an already terrible situation worse by hiding it from your kids and then having them find out later and just adding problems on top of the terrible situation.
Right. And I would say in the case of those kinds of very traumatic deaths is that it's kind of like this death conversation is kind of like the sex conversation. You don't need to tell them more details than they need at the time. So we can be very clear on that as not to create something in their mind that they don't need to know every small detail about it, but they can know the basics. And then as they get older, frankly, they're going to want to know more. Most of the time, they're going to want more details. And as they get older, you can tell them more. Because it's a continuing conversation. It's not over. Hopefully, in any of these, in the case of any time a parent dies, it's not a one-time conversation. It's a continuing conversation throughout their life. You
shouldn't view it as, okay, let's have the talk. And then move on and never speak about it again. Right. Okay. It's something I was just thinking about popped into my mind because I think you mentioned maybe reading to kids. Is there any maybe particular books you could recommend that I can put links in the show notes, but maybe something for young kids, grade school age kids, teenagers.
Right. I do have a book list, and I'll send you some links for the young children. Those are the ones that first come to mind, especially if you're just having trouble with the beginning of, what does death mean? And that's When Dinosaurs Die by Mark Brown, who did Arthur. He and his wife did that book.
Okay.
Also, for a more traumatic death, a terrible thing happened for young children. And also, there's a book I love. There's for any kind of loss, any kind of death in the family, Always and Forever. And I'll send you those links to put up. It gets a little trickier middle school and high school. I do have some. They're not coming top of my mind right now, but there are some books. Sometimes the way to connect a child, sometimes novels, if they're a reader, is really a way they like to, as they get older, to read about. My daughter loved all the very the diary of girls who lived in a different time, and it was all these very tragic things happened to them. They were real stories, but things like the wagon trains and the Civil War and different things that had happened to them. And I was like, that's really that's terrible. The baby sister died, the dad died. And to her, it was just, for some reason, she connected with those books. And I think a lot of children do. I think sometimes we really we shield them a little too much when they're really, because that's life, they want to read those things.
Do you happen to know what the name of that series was?
No, but I will look that up for you.
Okay, because there might be other people. In fact, maybe my daughter would want to read this. So I'd love to know what that is. Okay. I think we're reaching the end of our time here. This has been so great. I just have one more question. If you could say one thing to newly widowed parents, what would it be?
One thing. Oh, that's hard.
Or two or three. That's okay.
So one thing I would say is that you won't always feel the way you feel today. And I never give anybody a timeline because I really don't know. But you won't feel the way you feel today. And I think, I think I read this somewhere not too long ago, is being the good enough parent is good enough. I remember in my early days, my therapist would tell me, you're showing up. That's what they need. You're showing up. So trying, you're not going to do everything perfectly, but that's okay. And your kids really understand that, and they will understand that as they grow up. I think one thing sometimes the worst imaginable thing happens, but then you realize in the years to come, a lot of beautiful things happen too. My daughters and I are extremely close. They're close to one another, and there's a closeness, there's a resilience in them now, I see, because they've had to, children aren't resilient unless they've had to go through adversity. And they're also very empathetic humans. I'm very happy that they're very empathetic and they want to do a lot of good in the world. So I'm not sure how things would have turned out if it's not happened, but there's a lot of beautiful things that sometimes happen later on.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. My guest today is Lane Pease, Program Director at Kate's Club in Atlanta. So Lane, where can listeners find you or find Kate's Club if they want to know more about your work?
Right. We're at www.katesclub.org.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks, Jenny.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Lane Pease as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 11. And hey, it's not too late to get involved in Take Action Against Cancer Day of Service. If you've been widowed by cancer, head on over to takeactionagainstcancer.org and see how you can participate at home or online this weekend, the weekend of February 1st, 2019. Also, if you find this podcast interesting, would you please take just a moment and tell a widowed friend about it? Or maybe consider sharing the link to this week's episode on social media. You never know who it will reach. Thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.